perhaps the title of the panel is The Ends of Psychoanalysis, and the aim is to kind of engage with Gabriel's book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis, and Mohamed's forthcoming book, which is based on a thesis that he did over the past years entitled The End of Analysis. Somehow trying to broach both engagements in a sense. So I'm not going to say more here because we have a kind of a series of questions that we'll engage with afterwards. I'll just briefly introduce Mohamed. Mohamed Tel is a psychoanalyst. He's a member of BICAR. He's also a member of the Rome Institute. He recently completed a PhD from the University of Ljubljana, and his thesis is coming out as a book with Palgrave entitled The End of Analysis. Gabriel Tupinambá is a philosopher and a psychoanalyst who is based in Rio in Brazil. Oh, here again, Mohamed was based in Beirut for a while and now he's not. And perhaps, you know, we might come to this later about the space of psychoanalytic practice politically in a place like Beirut and whatnot. Gabriel is practicing in Brazil. He's also the head of social strategy at a new institute called Alameda, and he's also a member of the subset of Theoretical Practice Collective, and he's the author of Desire of Psychoanalysis, which came out in 2021 with MIT. So I think the way that this is going to go is that Mohamed and then Gabriel will each speak for 15 minutes about some of the main interventions or questions that they deal with in their works respectively. And then I'll have some general questions to both, which they'll respond to, and then we'll open it up to everybody who's here and so on. And I warn you at the beginning, we're already somewhat diving into the deep end of psychoanalysis. So we have to see how to broach this. And I think both of our speakers are open to answering questions of all sorts, of all kinds. Okay, so I'll perhaps let Mohamed speak a bit about the end of analysis, about the impossible fantasy of an end of analysis and the work that he wrote in relationship to that. Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for hosting us. Well, to start, psychoanalysis has departed with Freud's early experiments as a kind of therapy. And basically, the very term of psychotherapy has been advanced by Freud to qualify a category for psychoanalysis, which back then was considered the talking cure, rather a cure, within the medical practices. And let us say that it's basically psychoanalysis that established this category of psychotherapy, which then it had to separate from later on by this very delicate position that Freud and later on Lacan worked on building, which is that analysis is not without therapeutic effect. Yet this therapeutic effect does not occur by canceling a symptom, yet by producing one. So in a way, there is a major distinction to be held or to be retained between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, which is that psychotherapy aims at canceling a symptom, while psychoanalysis aims at producing a symptom, but not a symptom in the classical medical sense, but in the sense of amending structure by a symptom. So in this sense, the whole distinction between those two disciplines or those two categories has been developed progressively with Freud's understanding that actually the patient's complaint is not a complaint that demands, as the medical field and the psychology field understands it, as a demand to cancel a symptom or to align with the norms of normality, but rather as a complaint to push the symptom even further in order to amend those norms of normality, this knowledge of the other. So I think that as an introduction, this entry point into the subject allows us to have a frame for the whole work that I tried to develop in this thesis, which then became a book. How is it exactly that psychoanalysis can distinguish itself from therapy? And what does it precisely propose? And it's a debate that actually is not a classified matter at all. It's kind of constantly there within the psychoanalytic groups, within societies, within every exchange that happens between two analysts and between psychoanalysis at large and philosophy. To show a little bit how this debate becomes more tangible, one of the key elements where this debate becomes kind of clear is when we approach the topic of the end of analysis, because the end of therapy is kind of clear. It's reinstating a previous condition, which is supposed to be what there was previously before the symptom. While for analysis, it is a far more difficult question. What is this previous state that can be reinstated, since it's actually only by its loss that it gets posited as an ideal state? And here we have a direct line into the castration complex. It's basically we are constantly producing normalities, ideal normalities, which are figures of enjoyment, to reinstate. Therefore, it's the very loss of this state that posits it as being what needs to be reinstated, or it's a constant production of those figures of normality. So in a way, analysis cannot really afford to answer this question by saying, well, it cures. There's something more complex to be affirmed by analysis. And this is where the whole subject of the symptom and the importance of the symptom as a symptom comes into play. One of the earliest debates in the history of psychoanalysis that targets precisely this question is Freud's debate with Ferenczi, where Ferenczi sustains a theory of mourning, which he takes from Freud, except that he interprets it in his own way, which goes in the direction of a healing. In a way, Freud opposes it in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and puts it to a very rigorous trial, whether mourning or the theory of mourning is capable of directing an analysis, is capable of settling the whole hurdle contained in the subject's relation to the object. And there are, along the way, many points where Freud underlines that there is something in the very definition of the object that we're missing here, because in a way, mourning only works with the definition of the object that is a partial object, which with Lacan later on we understand that mourning only serves when it comes to the image of the object, but not to the object itself. And by the end of Analysis Terminable and Interminable, Freud somehow affirms that, well, the result of the analysis, which is rather tragic in his view and where he was able to lead it, is the kind of realization that the object and castration are one. that the object is the very lack of the object. And from there, I mean, Lacan takes the whole question into formalizing the objet, the object as lack, from which we start to grasp that Freud's answer was pointing towards something beyond mourning, which is on the side of melancholia, and on the side of melancholia and the direction of destitution, that there is a sort of destitution that exceeds mourning that is required to settle the relation to the object. Now, another figure of this debate is the question of the resolution of transference. For instance, in Ferenczi's argument, there is a kind of reference to this resolution of transference as being like the end point of analysis. And while Freud's position from it is very nuanced, he speaks of the fact that with the end of analysis, transference is never the same. And with Lacan's intervention on this topic, where he works through the function of the other, departing from Descartes, the whole problem of transference is advanced with Lacan as being a fact of speech, a very condition of speech, and a very condition of the subject's inscription in speech and his need to subtract himself from discourse through transference, through this subject suppositomy. And in this sense, what is being considered as a problem of analysis by Ferenczi for him to propose the resolution of transference as being a finality of analysis, well, with Lacan's work on transference, the whole idea of the traversal of transference becomes kind of limited, kind of ideological, in the sense that if it is not transference, what would it be? Given that there is no intersubjectivity. So, given that there is no intersubjectivity, it's always transference, and then the proposition of analysis has to be something, an articulation of transference, something to be done within transference. The only way out of the analyst's desire, which is the locus of transference for the analysant, is precisely in this arrival of the desire of the analyst within the analysant himself. So, in a way, Lacan's invention of those devices, those new devices back then, was precisely a response to the problem that there is no resolvable transference. There is no resolvability of transference. There is something to be done within transference. So this is another figure of this debate between therapy and anti-therapy, or therapy and psychoanalysis. A third figure, which is also an extension of the two first, is the question of naming, for instance. And indeed, it has been held for a long while that, in a way, the way out of an analysis to formalize the subjective destitution that the subject reaches by the end of his analysis is by naming. And by the naming of lack. The lack within a structure which allows him therefrom to think beyond the limitations there were before. Except that, I mean, the whole problem of discourse departs from naming. I mean, it is because of a name that there is a discourse. And it is because of a name that it is with a name that comes alienation. And how is it that we can think the problem that departs from a name to end on another name. You know? It's rather the reverse, that in fact, what occurs at the level of this formalization of destitution is rather an unnaming, something that unnames, but in the sense that it reduces a name again to a signifier by inscribing it in opposition again, and by submitting it to reasoning. In a way, in this trajectory I followed, somehow the idea of naming seems to be quite a continuation of this whole descendance of therapeutics, mourning, resolution of transference, and then naming. So this trajectory made me see the question of naming as a kind of revival of the theory of the traversal of fantasy. From there, we can go also to one of the sides of this debate, which is the traversal of fantasy, which, funnily enough, I mean, fantasy itself, the fundamental fantasy is precisely that fantasy may be traversed. That there is a beyond of fantasy, and that there is a beyond of fantasy in the sense that there is a jouissance beyond fantasy. What occurs in the end of analysis is rather not a traversal of fantasy, which is itself a fantasy, but rather the realization that jouissance beyond fantasy is the fantasy itself. In other words, that fantasy in it is inevitable. In a way, if there is a space for destitution, if there is a requirement for destitution, it's that. There's no beyond the fantasy. And finally, I would also mention the last side of this debate, which is the question of the institutionalization of psychoanalysis, of the formation of the analyst, which has been held for quite a long time under the term transmission of analysis. The very concept of the pass is not that it is just a procedure to select analysts based on whoever has demonstrated the end of his analysis. It's basically submitting the analytic knowledge to a trial. There is a jury of agreement sitting there, hearing the testimony of a passant that is being reported by a passer. So the whole question of the pass is not a transmission, but rather a framework in which is enabled a certain rupture in this discourse that is held by the jury of agreement or by the institution altogether. So in a way, the whole device of the pass, the whole procedure of la passe, was advanced by Lacan, to quote his last phrases in the October proposition. It's the task of submitting the discourse of the master to a trial that would purify it from fiction. So to reinvent it as a discourse of the analyst. And perhaps there I could conclude very briefly with a little point about this nature, this very delicate nature of the discourse of the analyst, which requires constant production of ruptures. And one of the figures that I like a lot is advanced by Lacan in Seminar 16, where he speaks about the discourse of the analyst as a discourse without words, as a process which only operates on another discourse, which only operates by cutting through another discourse, but as soon as it speaks itself, it turns into a discourse of the master or a discourse of the university. And in a way, I mean, for practicing analysts, for theorists as well, I believe this is a curse. This is a very difficult thing to handle. It means that the only thing that would make psychoanalysis survive is actually reinventing it all over again, constantly. I'm not sure if I exceeded.
This is great. Thank you, Mohamed. Yeah, no, thank you. That was really great. Okay, so I think we move to Gabriel. I'm just going to, are you there?
Yep.
There's already, yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good.
So first of all, I just wanted to really thank you, Nadia. Thank everyone at BICAR for putting this together. I'm really happy, not only the opportunity to continue conversations we've been having for a while already, but also to have this first opportunity, hopefully of many, to discuss with Mohamed his very enticing work. So for me, it's a great pleasure. What I thought of doing is just, I mean, giving you guys a kind of summary of the main argument of this book I wrote. It's kind of like not a very good marketing strategy because, you know, we'll just get the whole spoiler, so you don't need to read it. So perhaps I can save you guys some money. I mean, it's not like I'm making any bucks with it anyway. But also, I'm sure this will sound a bit confusing because there is some dense stuff in that argument, some stuff that makes sense when you read the whole thing. So perhaps it's actually a very good marketing tool because you will only dispel the confusion if you actually read it. The work that was summarized in this book as a kind of longer project, still ongoing project in many senses, it has a more critical point and then an initially constructive point. So you kind of can divide the book into 2 or 3 parts, I'd say. The critical part of the book is mostly concerned with this idea of defining something we could call a Lacanian ideology. And it's not meant to be great denunciation of the theory or anything like this. It's just something that I think it's meant to capture a lot of very practical, ordinary effects that you can spot in text written by us Lacanians. I'm definitely a very big proponent of this ideology myself. If anyone has free time and reads like the early stuff I wrote on Lacan, you'll be able to spot that the idiot who is capturing this is clearly me. I was the hamster of this theory in the laboratory. So so it's meant to actually capture a bunch of practical things you can find. And I would almost say it's not just a discursive strategy, even though that's where you most clearly can feel it, but I understand that it actually has deeper consequences. So the main idea is to, I guess, try to give a more profound or more kind of deeper account of why it is that most of the time psychoanalysis asks questions to which the things we already know about it are the answer. It can be on our own field. How do I deal with this case? Well, if you go to Lacan page, blah, 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 somewhere, blah, 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 there's an answer. Or how do we solve anyone else's problem in any other field? Well, Lacan page, blah, 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 already solved it. Very rarely we have a problem that either we don't know the page that has the answer in Lacan, or that requires you to talk to somebody else from a different field and actually listen to them. So rather than say that, well, the formalization of the subject is such a big topic, and then you don't want to talk about people who do this for a living. You already know that Frege said this about mathematics and logics, and you already have what you need. So why is it that it's so hard for us to pose questions in such a way that it's not simply that the answer is an operation on the question? There is an operation or generalization of very fundamental tools that we have and that are very important and crucial and definitely real and effective in specific contexts. But somehow, because perhaps the fact that they are real and effective in some places, it's very seductive to apply them elsewhere, in places where they're not opening up to contingency, to equivocation, to novelty. They're actually closing the pursuit of answers. So in the book, I try to show that this is not, let's say, the blame of us poor, stupid people. Well, Lacan and Freud, they know, they never made this mistake. No, the idea is that we're all in this together, and for all the great novelties that Jacques Lacan introduced to psychoanalysis, he too was very much responsible for setting up the conditions for this problem. And I try to suggest, and again, this is where the more kind of technical parentheses comes in, that the way that he came up with this really ingenious solution to explain what's going on with speech when we're talking in analysis to our analysts and so on, with the idea of let's borrow the concept of the signifier. Because in linguistics, signifier is meant to describe language in general. It's meant to talk about a minimal formal unit that you don't need to specify where and when and which language and in which context you're speaking. It's just a very, very basic fact of speech in general, that it is differential, so to speak. So I try to argue in the book that the moment that we do that, even though it brought many, many useful consequences, it also brought consequences that lead up to this thing I'm talking about, this ideological thing where we don't know the limits of our practice. It means not knowing when you should listen to other people because you're in their turf. Also means not knowing the limits of what we know about psychoanalysis that we still could learn about. Means not knowing where the clinical setting ends and something else begins, right? So the idea of a limit for our own field, in all its different receptions, kind of this confusion or obscurity about it is carried over or further reinforced by the lack of contours in this such fundamental concept as the signifier. Lacan also doesn't leave much space for us to think about the sort of common ground that exists between analyst and analysand. That is not just an imaginary counter-identificatory, counter-transferential connection. Of course, psychoanalysts are not present there just to agree, kind of fall into the seduction of whatever the patient is saying, and we are striving to create a certain disconnect, a certain solitude of the patient with their discourse so they can listen to themselves in a new way and come up with new enchainments in their discourse and so on. But there are clearly conditions to this. You can come into an analyst's office and feel such discomfort of being there due to other non-analytic reasons that you never come back, or that the analyst's interventions make no sense, or that you never feel at home to freely associate. And that's not just itself a fact about your psyche, that you're distorting your discourse due to that. No, some things are just left out because you never even got to analysis. So how do we think about these non-transferential relations, right? It is a relation of some sort, perhaps it's a social relation, cultural relation in a way that it's not covered by the psychoanalytic theory of culture, but it's there. So why isn't it not in Lacan? Well, it seems like the sort of thing that has to do with the establishing of the limits of psychoanalysis, right? The inner limits, where it begins. So we don't have much of that in Lacan. Another aspect that can show that there is a problem with this is that when Lacan tries to define the concept of act, who acts, who is intervening in the clinical setting, he starts clearly saying it's the analyst. Then he says between seminar 7 and seminar 10, 11, it's the analyst who is acting, because the desire of the analyst is the kind of the compass for that act. After seminar 12 up to seminar 14, it's actually the analysand's pursuit of the consequences of the act that makes it effective. So it's more on the side of the analysand than the analyst, the effective aspect. And by seminar 16, 17, psychoanalysis became a discourse. There is a social link. So you see the idea, well, there is no transferential relation, but there is a social link called psychoanalysis. So what the hell is going on? So you can see that he's trying to account for this. But the very, very basis of the theory, the way we treat language, the way we treat speech makes it really hard to make these things compatible. But you don't need to only look to Lacan. Of course, me and my colleagues were also to blame. So you can see this kind of difficulty with finding ways to address what is the limits of psychoanalysis in the way that we oscillate constantly between treating the unconscious as a singular category. So the unconscious helps us to frame only clinical cases and treat every patient as differently. We shouldn't really make generalizations. We should focus on the modes of enjoyment of different people. And then we oscillate to another pole where the unconscious is the mark of, the incompleteness of reality itself. And it's actually a negativity inscribed in the very logic of ontology itself. Like that's as universal as it gets. And those two ideas, they never meet. Either you have conversations where it's a singular thing, or you have conversations where it's a universal thing, and we never know how to bridge those two things. Well, again, it has a problem with the idea of limit. None of the two positions have limits. Either it's defined by the patient or defined by the theory, but we never can say it's particular. Things that are conditioning of our practice, like the way of dealing with money, the way with dealing with types of suffering, we simply cannot intervene upon, not because we don't want to, but you can try and nothing happens. So those things appear, and it's very hard to name them, bring them to serious theoretical debate. It seems like we don't have that many tools to do with that. And at the extreme level, the lack of tools to deal with the limits of psychoanalysis appears in the question of how do you name when something new happens? How do you recognize if something new happened to psychoanalysis, something that requires us to revise the theory, something that requires us to rethink presuppositions? Like, would we even recognize if something beyond the limit of current psychoanalysis emerged? Or is everything beyond the limit of psychoanalysis either a fantasy that we need to undo because we are presupposing that there is no castration, we're back at some naive desire for more than what we can get, or is actually an analysant's problem? Every analysant can learn something new, and the new thing they're going to learn is pretty much what we already know from Lacan, right? The last version of this problem is that once you don't know how to talk about that, and we don't know how to distinguish novel things that push the limit of a practice from distortions of that practice, is that even if it's an unconscious thing, we start becoming very annoying gatekeepers at our institutions because we need to preserve what we already know and dispel things that are not very clearly established, because we can't really tell apart if it's just naivety, lack of proper training, lack of proper analysis, or if something new is coming up that we should listen to. So that's the whole critical part of the book. Just to summarize the ending of it, I tried to propose some ways of keeping everything good that we've been developing with Lacan and Freud, but perhaps we need to reframe it a bit to open space for ways of moving forward with this. So the first thing I try to propose is that, well, we should start thinking and developing concepts to deal with the material and practical nature of this enclosure, which is the clinical setting. There are costs, there are things we need to do, and both patients and analysts, to create a space where people can freely associate. Though sometimes there is not enough food, not enough common culture, not enough shared risk, so that this is a possibility. It's not like it's everyone knows that they can sit in front of somebody and say whatever comes to their mind, and there won't be, told on or gossiped about, and that actually there is such a space as a secure space where you can say things. Money is one of the things that in many cultures, many contexts, guarantees that if I paid somebody, they will keep quiet about what I'm saying. They already got what they want. But the problem that money is solving is not even posed as a real problem. If somebody has trust issues with their analysts, that usually sounds like they have trust issues and not whether analysis is a trustworthy practice. So how do we name that problem? So that's the first thing I try to advance in the book. The second is that I try to show that a lot of Lacan's concepts become clearer when you add that question. Okay, where do these concepts, where are they meant to apply? So logic of sexuation, rather than applying to the whole domain of reality, if you first try to find the domain to which it applies, and I suggest it's speech under analysis, then it becomes much easier to explain what it is, or transference, it becomes easier to explain what it is. So those are kind of the places I try to take in the book, this debate, and it's definitely an open debate. The book doesn't manage to move much beyond the current state of the problem or stating the problem. And hopefully it's an invitation for everyone here to continue that very important discussion. What I would just like to say, just to conclude this, because I think it's a way also to bring this general thematics of the ends of analysis into play from a different angle, which is, Mohamed touches on this in his book as well, and I think it has become an interesting topic of debate among psychoanalysts, which is, what is the analytic stance on the, discourse of the end times, end of history? Everything's coming to an end. There is no position to change anything. And generally, I'm very skeptic that we have that for the very reasons I mentioned before. I'm very skeptic that we should look for the political import of psychoanalysis before we have a better grasp of the politics of psychoanalysis, meaning the politics that has to do with establishing free association, who gets access to analysis, who gets access to becoming an analyst. The more we deal with our own problems, I think the more equipped we are to also contribute to these debates. As I said, I think that it's part of the sort of ideological surplus of psychoanalysis, that it always feels equipped to have something to say about these bigger problems. Though I do see concrete issues that have to do with this general feeling that, like Christopher Lasch calls the era of diminishing expectations and things like this. And one thing that I see, for example, I'm not sure how general this is, but it's a certain transformation in which, whereas you read a lot of case studies that have this classic canonical structure where people come to analysis and they have a kind of realistic view of the future. Yeah, I have some idealized kind of idea. I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that. If this doesn't happen, I'm going to change where I go. And it's the past where trauma appears. They stumble with their words, they misremember things. It's very complicated to address the past. What I often get in the clinics these days, and I'm not sure what are the conditions for this to appear and if it's that general, but I get very often people who have a very idealized, prepackaged discourse about the past. It's just much more common to, account for your traumas in the past. First session, the person says, my traumas are this happened and this happened and this happened. That's why I'm the way that I am. But then when you say like, okay, what are you going to do for the next 4 years after you finish your undergraduate studies? And then you have weird screen memories of the future, like screen expectations. They say things that cannot do both at once. They stumble. They say they're going to do something, but you see that there is no material condition for that to happen. And you see anxiety is very much connected. It emerges from the future. It doesn't emerge from describing the past. And that does sound like a weird anxiety connected to the end somehow. Even though I'm not sure if there should be a general theory of that, but it does sound like something interesting to think about. I do think that there is some level in which, I like this idea that there was a kind of revolutionary period in modernity where the past was very saturated and the future was very open to something we didn't know what it was. Then there was a second period after the Hobsbawm's era of revolutions where revolution wasn't really the catchword for what to expect of the future, but war was much better. So it's not that it's an unknown in the future. It's either this or that, either fascism or liberalism or state socialism. So it wasn't about, let's say, a totally unknown future that revolution would bring about, and we don't know what it is. So it's a place to put your fantasies, your utopian expectations. It had content, but it had still bifurcations. So we did get like a revolutionary period where the future looked like it's an unknown and the past is very saturated. Then we get this very long period in the 20th century where the future has possible bifurcations. It can either go this way or that way. And we start opening up the past, because with war, it becomes a big problem of let's not repeat the past. So the kind of Adorno suggestion, whatever we do, let's not do Auschwitz again if we can, please, right? But we actually managed to go even deeper into that situation where the future seems to be absolutely contrived and either is total destruction or the same. And suddenly the past became the place where people expect new things to happen. The past is the place where you should unearth the tradition of the oppressed, or new readings of the past, or new lost heroes of the past, and those things should have the emancipatory potential. It's a very strange situation, which I think psychoanalysts should be careful with, because it just makes us way too enticing for all the wrong reasons, because there is some idea that we are experts on finding new stuff in the past, right? So it is an interesting thing that somehow a certain crisis of political imagination also brings a certain, I mean, how fundamental this is to psychoanalysis is debatable, but brings this to the fore as a kind of convergence between psychoanalysis and that imagination.
Thanks, Gabriel. No, great. So maybe I'll just a few things and then we'll open it up to everybody. I'm sure there's a lot of comments and questions from the floor. But it's great that you end on this, because I think one of the questions, and I feel like somehow both of you have already kind of answered the questions we'd kind of shared. I think the way that Mohamed starts his his book is by this declaration that the crisis, and of course, interestingly, one needs to flag here that Mladen Dolar writes the foreword to that book saying that psychoanalysis is in deep shit, it's in crisis, analysis terminable, interminable, and Slavoj wrote the introduction, right, to your book saying, right, that this is the book that all Lacanians must read from here on, right? Of course, this is kind of just to put on the side. It's very interesting, kind of in relationship to, how would one say, a certain engagement philosophically and politically with psychoanalysis that has been the most salient, but at the same time seems to be the place that, at least at the beginning, your work has been conversant with or talking to in separate ways, both of you. But so Mohamed says in the introduction of his book that the end of psychoanalysis is the end of liberalism. Okay, he makes this kind of, if we think of a crisis of psychoanalysis, it has to do with a crisis or the endpoint of liberalism. I'm going to just ask Mohamed perhaps to comment on that in relationship to the idea that you propose, that this problem of limits or the limits of psychoanalysis has to do with thinking about, or its limitations as being, as for us to consider, that is it the only place within which we play out our ideations or our fantasies of an ideal, right, that we kind of work through and work out and so on, or our attachments to certain ideals. And hence, this opens up in many ways the political problem, the political question, or the question of the political engagement of psychoanalysis, or what can psychoanalysis offer still to politics, right? So in a sense, from the desire of psychoanalysis and how to traverse the fantasy of psychoanalysis, somewhere in between. I mean, maybe if you two can just comment on this, the question of the ends, the limits, the political, because before, up till today, it was always that psychoanalysis is such a problematic field precisely because it does not keep to its place, right? It doesn't shut up. It talks about all these things and interferes in all these places that it should not, right? It must remain silent about. And it seems as though there's a different way of posing that question from our current historical moment in both your works, I suppose. Maybe if you could just comment on this comment. Yeah. Ahmed, are you still there? Yeah, I'm just trying to interpolate, I guess, both of you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Would you like me to start first, or Gabriel?
Sure. I don't know. I mean, what? Yeah.
As you like. Okay. Let me just quote this phrase that you're referring to, which is in the acknowledgements, which is liberalism has collapsed. Neutrality is no longer an asset, and the joke of well-being is over. And after that, there is a kind of challenge to the analyst, of today's analyst, where a challenge which I formulate as follows: either an analyst or an imbecile, you can no longer be both. Imbecile in the sense that he who knows not in whose service he's acting. Perhaps to explain this point, I'd need to go back and work a little bit on the question of where's the limit of psychoanalysis and this relation between the end of analysis and the end of liberalism. To think of the limit of psychoanalysis, I believe it would make things a little more difficult to answer. It's rather that analysis has itself been a limit, in the sense that where does analysis start? Where has it always started? It started always with anxiety. It starts always where there's something, the system, structure that doesn't work, or perhaps that works so well to the point that it triggers anxiety in us, in the subject. And it is only there that the subject refers to this clinical analysis, which analysis is not limited to the clinical, but to say simply, when does a subject goes to see an analyst? It's basically when his anxiety forces him to. Analysis always starts at the limit of the functioning of ideology and the effect of ideology on the subject. So in this sense, I cannot but think of analysis as being itself a limit. Departing from that, one could see analysis as a kind of space, a discursive space where structure may be put into question, where the other may be questioned. Although when the analyst goes to see an analyst, he basically takes it on himself. He imagines that everything can be settled with a theory of referring to his impotence, while actually the whole working through of analysis is rather targeting the fact that it's enjoyment itself that doesn't work, and that it's rather impossibility than impotence. So in a way, analysis kind of allows the discourse of the hysteric to get formalized in a rather more radical statement, in a rather more radical position from the discourse of the master. Yet, there's another side of the question, which is this equation between the end of analysis and the end of liberalism. Well, we need also to amend a little bit this idea of the end of analysis, because if indeed, given that there is no resolution of transference, the only way out of analysis is the way in, which is the desire of the analyst, right? So the end of analysis is basically the start of analysis. Okay. Basically, when one ends his analysis, he's kind of an analyst, whether he practices or not, but he's basically acquainted with this position by which he can survive as a subject and subtract himself constantly from discourse and from ideology. We are in a historical moment where we do not really have the option not to think, where we are witnessing on the one hand the collapse, but on the other hand, an economy that is skyrocketing again in quite a pornographic way, and where we are grasping what this liberalism was made of. Not that it was liberalism, it was the happy years and now we're in shit. No, actually, this is the truth of liberalism that is being exposed. This is what it is. The joke of well-being is over. The joke of self-care is over. The joke of all those freedoms that have been sold in the market is over. Yes, it is a moment where, of course, analysis is in deep shit, as Mladen wrote in the foreword. But on the other hand, it is also a moment where there's no other option than to think. There's no other option than to start analysis anew.
I mean, I guess Mohamed's position is, or in a sense, it's somehow there's the theory of discourse remains in a way important and instructive in this place, I suppose, and also in a way this the engagement with, or the question of, you know, the singularity or the kind of the subject that emerges from the process of analysis. And I suppose here, you know, I guess with your pessimism about analysis, you have a bit of a more ambitious proclamation in terms of the political component, in a sense. I mean, it would be interesting if we were to be able to make this link in the sense of, if I understand properly what you're saying, you think that this, the question of the subject, or kind of thinking about the procedure, you call it generic and so on, and that there's something, you know, how to kind of reinsert it in a more infinite process that I think perhaps for you the stakes are, is there a way to collectivize the analytic position, and how to, perhaps you want to comment on this. I mean, I'm just trying to segue. It's weird. I mean, you have two books. I'm just sorry. I mean, if
no, it makes total sense. Okay. Actually connects well with.
It's a yeah. So, but if you can kind of segue into that, that would be, I think, this would help.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, it's funny because you know, I think we spoke about this when I was in Beirut, and I've been thinking that this is actually a very interesting enigma. Again, Mohamed it's also giving us a very good example of this, because one must ask, I guess, why is it that, you know, some of the, I mean, at least for me, some of the most interesting conversations I've been having about, you know, unthought aspects of psychoanalysis are appearing in places that are more well acquainted, more intimate, let's say, with social collapse, you know, than places that are perhaps a bit still fascinated by the simple fact that the horizon is decreasing or diminishing. I mean,
yeah, it's against the Millerian line, sorry, which both of you, I mean, in many places, I don't know if you say this online, but both of you kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's not the best thing. I don't want to focus too much on it, but
yeah.
Yeah. But not only that, I mean, I'd include many of my very, very dear colleagues and who are just, I mean, it's just an interesting fact that, you know, if you're constantly bombarded by problems of practical problems of how am I going to keep this practice that I think I truly believe in, I think it's effective, it's interesting, it should be continued. How do I keep it under dire conditions, under non-standard conditions, and where, you know, places where not everyone, Lacan is not part of the culture, or where, you know, it's just expensive, like it's crazy, and or as an analyst I have to deal with things that I don't see anyone talking about. And I think that there's definitely a connection in the sense that a certain liberal bubble bursting is potentially, I'm not sure if it will, bring some questions to the fore within that bubble, But I think that there is a correlation between places where that bubble either never was properly formed or burst a long time ago, and the fact that there is these very interesting and interventions appearing. I think of Patricia Gerovich's work also with psychoanalysis in the barrios, but Bechara's work on Egypt and other places. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's a rethinking that appears from places that are historically left out of that bubble. So that's one direction. The end of liberalism towards the end of psychoanalysis. The inverse direction, I tend to prefer to keep things separate. Like, I don't think collectivizing psychoanalysis has any necessarily political import. I just think that it's always has been like that. I mean, if you remove that dimension of the things we already do, it's hard to understand why we do it. So going through your peers, learning from other case studies, not your own, those things are, and requiring some level of collective absorption of the anxiety of clinical practice. Those are real functions of collectivity in psychoanalysis, and they're always been like that. And there is politics in that, because there is economics, class struggle, there is other types of segregation that goes on in these dimensions. So before it has political import, it has stakes on the existence of psychoanalysis more now than ever, that these things are properly theorized, discussed, and we concern ourselves with who has power inside the analytic community to pitch how we should approach this collective dimension. I do think that psychoanalysis has interesting roles to play inside political organizations, to provide tools to that political imagination. To kind of conclude on this point, I would even say that, I personally have been more and more distrustful of the political discourse that is built on the recognition of the end or anything. I don't think that anything comes out of that. And I do think that there is an issue there, which is you can never tell when you diagnose the end of something or the lack of a horizon, if it's because there's nothing there or because you're not in a position to see it. And I think most political things can only be seen from an organized point of view rather than an individual point of view. But then we create the paradox, which is, how do you organize so that you're in a collective position where you can see that there is a horizon? In fact, there's a lot of stuff happening. But to get there, you need to find a way to incorporate yourself into something collective without the reference to this thing that you cannot see on your own. Psychoanalysis has a good news that, well, you can turn means into ends and find satisfaction where you thought you couldn't. And that's not always synonym with distortion, bureaucratization, ossification, deviation from a program. It can mean emancipatory things. So that is something interesting that I think psychoanalysis can kind of move away from help politics move away from a fascination with the end, not even engage that much in that debate in a certain sense. So just to go there as well, because I think that's also, let's say, you mentioned optimism and pessimism, and I think, unfortunately, I'm a bit of an optimist, not an optimist, but yeah, something. Something. Yeah.
We have is it a word in Arabic, متشائم is probably, yes, which is both somehow, both pessimo-optimist. I don't know how to.
That sounds perfect. Yeah.
So I'm going to because obviously this can go on. We can do this, and it would be a bit narcissistic to keep doing this on our own. I want to open this up to discussions. I think I was told that the way to do this is we begin by if there are questions from people online. So from the small other to the big other.
Sure, if everyone can hear me. Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, Mohamed, for this very interesting talk.
Let me just check. Can you hear the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to go back to the main title of the summer school. What can psychoanalysis offer for militants? And I want to ask, what can militancy offer for psychoanalysis, for psychoanalysts? I would like Gabriel to elaborate more on the political economy of psychoanalysis, because I was joking with some comrades behind, and I thought that maybe psychoanalysis can offer some cheap sessions for militants, let's say. Let's start with this. And maybe the answer is not always to be found in the knowledge surplus that the psychoanalysis always amazes us with, but actually in some practical and militant actions to be taken. So I think, it's kind of weird that today the cheapest session is around like $50, and like, who the fuck can like afford $50?
I offer cheaper.
Yeah, so like, but still, like when we are talking about militants, I don't think that we're specifically only talking about middle-class students living in Beirut. Like, there's the peripheries too.
Sure.
So I'm just like thinking about this, and I would like to hear from you as practicing analysts. What can you offer us more than the intellectual answer, like on a more practical, on a more practical level?
Well, I suggest that Gabriel start, since it is addressed to him in the first
Sure.
place.
But I just want to point out that it started with a very interesting question that I hadn't heard before, which was, what can militants do to analysis? But then it shifted back to, what can analysts do? Both are interesting, but I like the first part also a lot. I'll start with the first part just because we never discussed it, and it interests me a lot as well, because I think that the first thing is that the challenge is both ways. I think that when we say psychoanalysts should probably realize certain limitations and contradictions and think we don't know before we assume we know them in other fields. I think that's also something I at least go through in my political life, in the sense that, as Marxist, communist, whatever you want, I also must admit that we have very little knowledge about how our own political economy as militants, so the labor that goes into militancy, the costs, the way that this creates contradictions between commitments we need to have in order to be employed, in order to rest, in order to have basic health, actually conflict with how politics is done and how we organize ourselves. So it's funny, because I'd say something psychoanalysts could learn from militants. It's that, organizing around labor conditions, organizing to pressure communities into recognizing demands that are not being met. That's something that, militant socialist, communist militants are doing for a long time. So there'd be something to learn about that for analysts. And currently in Brazil, I'm involved with a group of people, and we're trying to just create a big group of people who want to be like a pressure group to go to Lacanian schools and say, look, this is the face of new young training analysts. These are the type of things we need. We don't need another seminar on Lacan and Fanon and more theory. The theory is fine. The problem is that we don't have time to access it. There is no grants or scholarships for students. Analysis is expensive. These environments are not welcoming to us. So that's questions more concerning work conditions of young practicing analysts outside of a liberal bubble than theoretical questions. And supposedly we should be able to learn something about how to do it from socialist militants. But I'd say that in many places in the world, at least the places I've been involved, it hasn't been easy for people in militant circles to also thematize these contradictions inside political organizations. So I think there's a parallel movement in that. Like, the more these things can be thematized within militant circles, the easier it will be for them to be also, let's say, of use to Lacanian analysts who are interested in the politics of psychoanalysis. Because clearly the problem is not just lack of desire to be helpful from analysts. There is an actual economic problem. So the more we can treat it on structural terms, the easier it is to make that connection. So that turns us to the second part of the conversation. I do think that, I mean, Lebanon situation is incomparable to Brazil in that particular sense that, you know, I've never lived in a place with that degree of inflation. I mean, there is extreme hunger, extreme precarity in Brazil, but fluctuations in value is very different than something that, you know, it's in the long run a precarity, and it's a different situation. So I'm very interested to see how we could approach it differently. In Latin America, we're actually dealing with this in a kind of, I believe, in an interesting critical way, because there has been a lot of desire to attend to social demands from the standpoint of young analysts, and we create public clinics and things like this. But they then incur in the same problem that is not being treated at the level of some militant circles, which is it's unsustainable because you need to do it voluntarily, and then you're not getting paid to do it. And that means you're going to start a bunch of analysis that you're not going to follow through. You're going to be able to be there for 6 months, and then you're going to say, fuck, I need to work, because you need the money as well. So it's getting out of that circuit. It's complicated all around. Everyone's concerned with, you know, how to connect transforming the situation with surviving and feeding the basic pieces becomes a common problem. So you can build on that commonality. That's how I would approach it. But yeah, it deserves definitely more discussion. It's a very, very crucial problem. I totally agree.
Mohamed, do you want to comment on the question? And then we have a number of questions from the floor.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll try to be very brief.
Yeah.
I think the question is very relevant, precisely because I think that whoever goes to an analyst and crosses the preliminary sessions and, you know, goes beyond the 3 first sessions is de facto a militant. In what sense? In the sense that if it goes through those preliminary sessions, in general, the analyst has clearly a grasp that this is a space that is not going to fix him in the medical sense of the term, but rather a space where he's going to contemplate, analyze what makes him live, what makes him do what he does, what makes him feel what he feels, and so on. And it's going to open the question of his desire, his place as a subject, and so on. So I believe that there is already, in crossing the threshold of the medical complaint, I think that analysis has a kind of double relation with militancy. On the one hand, analysis is constantly providing a space for a militant project. Like, there is no analysis if there is no militant. On the other hand, what it puts under the microscope constantly is this very idea of freedom that is being fought for, and which in general contains the very seed of alienation. It's the very idea of freedom to which we are alienated. And the whole problem that analysis engages in is that, what if we are actually going deeper into alienation by the very way we perceive freedom from this alienation? What if actually this opposition to the other, this revolt against the other, is precisely what is being commanded? You know, so somehow it makes the course for the militant quite more complex. On the other hand, yes, it is true that analysis in general costs a lot, and I believe that this is not only due to the fact that the analyst wants to live and so on, but it's also due to the fact that many of, I mean, especially when I practiced in Lebanon for quite a lot of time, many of the practicing analysts and many of the specialists in analysis in Lebanon were kind of brought up in some very deep rooting of the analytical theory to the liberal context. And it was quite rare to see leftist analysts. I mean, it's very rare. There was me and Nadia and maybe one or two more. When it comes to the cost of analysis is not only the necessity as lived or experienced by the analyst, but also the ideology behind and his alienation to the whole setting and how much he's able to withdraw himself from it or structure his relation to it. I personally had many occasions in which, I mean, I had patients pay for sessions with art production, with something else than what is usually conceived. Although it was always a little portion, because otherwise it would be impossible. I mean, this is to say that, yes, in general, the cost of analysis is not cheap, but it's not only due to analysis, it's also due to factors that are beyond analysis itself and that relate to the people who are practicing. For instance, since I moved to Dubai, I started working with institutions, with clinics, because here to open a clinic is basically to open a business. This is a very complicated thing. So basically, by working with institutions, you also have to conform to a set of limitations. So this is also.
Thanks, Mohamed. So I'm going to take a number of questions maybe after each other, and then we get a response, I think, rather than, because I think we have 15 minutes left. Is that it? So Paris, would you like to begin with a question?
Obviously, the connection between your two talks is that you're both looking for ends in some respect. Of course, if I may use a little bit of Lacanian jargon, or rather structuralist jargon, the diachronic end of analysis versus the synchronic limit of analysis, which of course may change. But apropos of this end, I'd like to put that in suspension with something that I find to be extremely, let's put it this way, underrated, especially within the Lacanian ideology about psychoanalysis. If it's encapsulable in one phrase by Lacan, it's se mettre à l'épreuve du réel, or being put to the test of the real. And I won't cite the page because Gabriel will accuse me of Lacanian ideology, but what I take this to mean is effectively, in blunt jargon, shit happens. And one bit of Lacanian ideology that I've noticed is that both as far as the end of analysis is concerned, but also the limits of analysis, that we'd like to delimit in strong ways and often romanticize what the hell that means. And what I'm wondering is if you both can address in your respective ways the issue of the stupidity of contingency as far as the lesson of analysis is concerned, the fact that shit happens, and that in the case of the end of analysis, we might not know whether that's a delimitable concept to begin with, let alone when it happens. And in the case of Gabriel, that we might not know what the limits are. of analysis. Sometimes it's inappropriate to act like an analyst with your friends, but nonetheless, sometimes they do in fact commit a phenomenon.
Okay, I'm gonna just stay with that for a bit, and then I'm gonna take another, Yasmin?
Thank you, Mohamed and Gabriel, for such an interesting talk. I was basically just wondering, in like the historical context of the last decades, specifically in the MENA region, where so many traumatic experiences happened, including revolutions, civil wars, etc. I was basically just wondering how, at least in my surroundings, very much loads of people, because so much happens, have very much naturalized the process of trauma. And I was just wondering, how do psychoanalysis basically cope with that, specifically with the last decade and developments ongoing, with like basically the process against the naturalization of trauma itself? And what are the main obstacles with raising awareness of the importance of psychoanalysis? Thank you.
There's a third question. Oops.
My name is
Yeah.
Hi. So, okay, I'm gonna try to be quick, but basically there was like a frustration from the conversation when we talking about like alienation, and then thinking about the very material things that leads people to psychoanalysis, that's like looking for that anti-alienation framework, because there's material suffering in that, and then kind of like thinking that, okay, theoretically and conceptually, we're going to just embrace that this is just, it's about like accepting alienation. And then to continue kind of following up what Fatima was saying about like what can militants give to psychoanalysis. And yes, they definitely can give a lot, and you can like even I have been lucky to like get a year and a half of analysis at like for free, but then my analyst is a white man who is, of course, in London, like what is the other like patient that they will get compared to what I can give to their praxis, for my experiences, is it, like kind of all of that, and how am I enriching that practice? And also like thinking to just speak to Mohamed and saying that like they refer to analysis as a symptom, and so kind of isn't that in itself very much clear that what is the end of analysis? If analysis is a symptom of the kind of anxiety that the racist patriarchal capitalism is creating, then the end of analysis is the like kind of taking that symptom away. And how does that happen? Like, isn't it, if to liberate someone, you need to be liberated from yourself as well? And then does that not mean being liberated from your position as a psychoanalyst?
Did you hear the last?
Sorry, can I just yeah, but I didn't get her name.
Volshare.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to also tie to the first question a little bit, and maybe come with a small provocation and ask you, do you need an analyst for an analysis? Which means in a way, or like I wonder, can you imagine, or do you know of basically social practice that maybe isn't exactly analysis, but that derives sort of, or takes certain practices, way of communicating that are able to maybe do something like free association, or address the elephant in the room in different ways that can be practiced by people as like a collective on a more running basis, something that could be passed on to a group by scores of sorts that can be performed, or is that completely unthinkable?
Yeah, the thing with all questions, I think they all, in my position, they all reach the same point, and it goes to show something that, I mean, I'm not the one to think that, we should keep things in their little boxes because everything is a different thing. They shouldn't be mixed. In reality, everything is mixed. But sometimes knowing where to demand something, where to address a certain demand is a good thing, because otherwise we formulate it in a way that we simply cannot get a response, even though the response might be possible. So why am I saying this? Because, for example, in Brazil, in my experience, one thing I've come to recognized, and I think it requires a lot of theory that we don't have to properly account for. But I don't think psychoanalysis is the best place to take all traumas. Not every trauma can be worked through in analysis. And my impression is that traumas that have to do with a specific size of people, of groups, meaning small familial groups that have, basically dyadic forms. You're hurt by somebody, through somebody, with somebody, not with a big group, not with the state, not with the police, not with a natural disaster. Those can be treated in a dyadic space with one other person, and transference has a specific type and form. But not every trauma fits that. And I've worked, and I have a lot of comrades who worked with people who went through torture in a dictatorship. And it's not a trauma that has the form of a dyadic relation. It's not a relation with a person. It's a relation with the institution, with the system, with a moment in the country. And when they get politicized, when they get involved with collectives that struggle to make sure what happened in the dictatorship is recognized, not naturalized, those things are better worked out, emptied out of their phantasmatic dimensions than anything I can do. So that's not an impotence of the clinic. It's just that not everything is meant to fit in the analytic session. And that's a good thing. I do think that there is a very bad partnership right now, that because analysts offer themselves as empty addressees, we like that everyone asks things of us because it also makes us feel very important, but we're limited into what we can intervene upon. I have the impression, that's my current hypothesis, we can only intervene traumas connected to love at the sphere of a family in a very broad abstract sense. So there are many other practices that have something that is analogous to analytic effects, to go to the last point. Politics can produce this, science can produce this, art can produce this, because you emptied out fantasies you had about how things always need to be, or how this kind of additional commitment you create on this can only be this way, couldn't be other way, and that's just how things are, right? Depending on the type of problem, the type of situation, the type of matter at hand, it requires different formats. And just so happens that one of those formats is called clinical psychoanalysis, and it does manage to intervene in some things rather than others. This is helpful because I think on the one hand, it helps to show that we should strive to create other addresses for some of these things, that other partnerships, other interventions, other spheres are better equipped than psychoanalysis. But it also shows that, well, there are some things you shouldn't take elsewhere. You're much better taking it to the clinic. And I unfortunately must say, I don't know, and I don't trust, to be honest, there are that many practices, especially not group practices, that get to intervene on something which is intrinsically connected to intimacy. And that in some level, it's good that you don't over-politicize it. Because if I work with a lot of I think you need to close the mic on the other. I work with a lot of militants in Brazil. I have a lot of patients who are comrades and communists and other ways. And the subjective relief that comes from knowing where politics also has limits and private fantasies appear that you want to treat as part of your intimacy, not as a public matter or a collective matter. That's a good thing. So it's not the sense that everything should be in their little box, but there is a connection between knowing how to address something to the proper address and getting an effective answer. And I think we are effective in some things rather than others. That is valid for both the issue of trauma, which I don't think psychoanalysis has the right to become a monopoly on this, either the concept or the treatment. A lot of therapeutic, in a stronger sense, not just a small remedy, but in the sense of working through something, happen in other places. And I know people who are ridiculously savvy and realistic and ready to deal with the contingency of politics, who are entangled in their personal analysis with private matters. And there are a very big number of people who are amazingly smooth to deal with the libidinal issues in their life and are absolutely idiotic when it comes to politics and think they can solve everything at an individual level. Collective politics doesn't exist, can't read a conjuncture for their life depends on it, and usually does. So those two things don't really map onto each other. And I think it's good to separate them a bit so you can get the best out of each address. That leads me to the thing about the real in psychoanalysis. That's why I don't like using that concept very much. It is one of the core ideas to guarantee the monopoly over these effects, the subjective effects, because for some reason, the people who decided that they need the concept of real, that's the weirdest concept to have. Real, like what the hell? Like everyone deals with this. Not analysts have the privilege of caring for the real. There's the real in politics, the real in science, the real in many places. We don't have the monopoly over it. So shit happens in many senses, right? And not always the analytic setting is the best place to acknowledge that happening as such. In many senses, we add more fantasy in psychoanalysis rather than remove it when we pretend like we are in position to work through some things. I've been, it's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, which is to be the analyst of people who are going through natural catastrophes, lose their whole families, for example. I have absolutely nothing to do. I can only be with them as another impotent person who, as an individual, doesn't have anything to help with. What can I do? I helped like I would help anyone. Like I helped raise money. I helped to, find a place for burying people. But is that analytic work? That's not analytic work. It's just mild decency and solidarity. And that's not something electricity went off. It's just me and you, Mohamed. We're out, and everyone online. So it's perfect. Okay, I'll use that as a sign of that I should shut up anyway.
Are you there?
Yes.
I'm just seeing if I'm muted. Thing is, we've gone a bit over time and the electricity is gone, and I think people are, so I was gonna just give it a chance for a closure, but I don't know. It's kind of come to an end. I think that was the end. I'm really sorry we lost the connection again. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll catch up again. We'll continue this. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Bye.
Ciao.